The year is 1944. The Ardennes forest is a graveyard of frozen steel and shattered dreams. A German soldier, Hans, huddles in a frozen trench. His stomach isn't just empty. It's a vacuum. For weeks, his entire regiment has survived on ersatz bread, a sawdust-filled brick, and a watery soup made from horse meat of animals killed by artillery. To the German high command, a soldier was a machine that required minimal fuel. But to the soldier, the war was no longer about borders or ideologies. It was about the agonizing, gnawing pain of starvation. They were told America was a crumbling nation, its people rioting for scraps, its industry paralyzed. This lie was the only thing keeping the German line from snapping, until the day the Americans overran their position. Hans and his comrades were marched behind Allied lines, expecting a bullet or a labor camp where they would surely starve to death. Instead, they were led into a massive canvas tent. The smell hit them first, a scent so rich, so alien, it felt like a hallucination. It was the smell of melted butter, roasted meat, and white flour. As the German pows stood in line, trembling from exhaustion, an American cook, sloppy, grinning, and looking remarkably well-fed, slapped a tray in front of them. Hans looked down, and his heart stopped. On the tray sat a massive mound of fluffy mashed potatoes, a thick slab of roast beef dripping in gravy, a pile of buttered corn, 3 slices of pure white bread, and a pint of fresh milk. The mess hall fell into a haunting silence. The Germans didn't eat. They stared. Hans whispered to his sergeant, "Sir, we must be careful. This is a trap. They are going to execute us, and this is our last meal." The sergeant, eyes wide, replied, "No, Hans. Look at the Americans. They are eating the same thing. They aren't even finishing it. They are throwing leftovers in the bin." That was the moment the German spirit broke. Not when the Sherman tanks rolled over their trenches, but when they saw the American trash can. In Germany, people were dying for a crust of bread. In the American camp, soldiers were discarding more calories than a German family saw in a week. To a European in the 1940s, white bread was a luxury reserved for the ultra-wealthy or special holidays. The German Kommissbrot was dark, heavy, and bitter. When the Poles touched the American Wonder Bread, they were terrified. They squeezed it, watching it bounce back into shape. One prisoner famously shouted, "They are feeding us cotton. This isn't food. It's a trick." It wasn't until they tasted the sweetness of the refined flour that the reality set in. This wasn't a special meal. This was Tuesday. As the Poles were transported to the United States via Liberty ships, the shock deepened. They weren't being taken to a wasteland. They were being taken to a land of impossible abundance. While Hitler was struggling to find enough gasoline to move a single Tiger tank, the Americans were using their fuel to run ice cream barges. Yes, the U.S. Navy actually spent over $1 million to build a floating ice cream factory in the Pacific. When the German prisoners heard about this, the psychological war was over. They realized they weren't fighting a military. They were fighting a grocery store with a global navy. One German officer famously remarked, "I knew we had lost the war when I saw an American transport plane deliver a crate of fresh pineapples to the front line. We couldn't even get bread to our men 5 miles away." By the time the war ended, something bizarre had happened. German Poles held in American camps had gained, on average, 10 to 15 pounds. They were sent back to a destroyed, starving Germany, looking healthier than the civilians who had stayed behind. They returned to their villages with stories that sounded like fairy tales. In America, they would tell their hollow-cheeked families, "Every man has a car, and every soldier has a stake." These men became the greatest ambassadors for the American way of life, not because of political speeches, but because of the sheer power of the American cavalry. History books focus on the guns, the generals, and the grand strategies. But the truth of World War II is found in the mess tin. The Allied victory was built on a foundation of logistics and production. The American giant food servings weren't just about hunger. They were a psychological weapon. They showed the enemy that while they were fighting for a 1,000-year Reich on an empty stomach, the Americans were fighting for a future that was already overflowing with milk and honey. The German Poes weren't just stunned by the meal. They were stunned by the realization that they had been lied to. You can't defeat a nation that treats its prisoners better than your government treats its heroes. The war was not lost on the maps of generals, but in the stomachs of the men who fought it. If the first encounter with American food was a shock to the German Poes, what followed in the weeks and months of their captivity was a psychological dismantling of everything the Nazi regime had built. As the thousands of captured soldiers were moved from the front lines of Europe to the heartland of America, they weren't just moving to a different continent, they were moving to a different reality. They had been told for a decade that the master race was destined to rule because of their superior willpower. But as they sat in the mess halls of camps in Kansas, Texas, and Mississippi, they realized that willpower meant nothing against a nation that could produce a mountain of butter for every single soldier. The second wave of shock came when the prisoners realized the sheer variety of the American diet. And the German army, if you were lucky enough to get meat, it was a mystery stew of gristle and fat. But in the American camps, the prisoners were introduced to the steak, to a man who had been eating sawdust bread. A thick, juicy cut of beef was not just food, it was a message. It was a message that said, we have so much resources that we can feed our enemies like kings. The Germans would sit in stunned silence as they were served unlimited helpings of sweet corn, thick gravies, and something they had almost forgotten existed, fresh fruit. The sight of a bowl of oranges or a crate of apples in the middle of a world war was more terrifying to the German officers than 1,000 bombers. It proved that the Atlantic was not a barrier for America. It was a highway. One of the most incredible stories from this period involves a group of German U-boat sailors who had been captured. These men had lived in cramped, stinking submarines for months, surviving on moldy bread and canned grease. When they arrived at a POW camp in the United States, they were served a breakfast of pancakes dripping in maple syrup, crispy bacon, and scrambled eggs made from real, fresh eggs, not the powdered yellow dust they were used to. They actually went on a hunger strike for the first 24 hours. Why? Because they were convinced it was a death row meal. They believed that no nation would give such high-quality food to a common sailor, unless they were going to be executed the next morning. It took an American officer who sat down and ate the exact same meal in front of them to convince them that this was just a normal Tuesday breakfast in America. As the prisoners were integrated into work programs, often helping on American farms, the shock deepened into a profound sense of betrayal by their own government. They saw American farmers driving tractors and trucks while the German army was still using horses to pull their artillery. They saw small-town grocery stores overflowing with sugar, coffee, and chocolate items that had vanished from Germany years ago. The psychological impact was devastating. The German soldiers began to ask themselves, if the Americans are living like this while fighting a war onto oceans, what kind of monsters are our leaders for sending us to fight them with nothing? The food had done what the bullets couldn't. It had turned the soldiers against the ideology of the Third Reich. The American sugar power was perhaps the most effective tool of all. In Germany, Sugar was strictly rationed and used almost exclusively for industrial purposes. In America, it was everywhere. The prisoners were given Coca-Cola, Hershey bars, and massive slices of apple pie. For a soldier who hadn't tasted real sugar in 3 years, the first sip of a cold soda was like a lightning bolt to the brain. They became addicted to the American lifestyle. There are records of German prisoners who, after eating American rations for a month, refused to eat their traditional German recipes because they found them bland and depressing. They had been conquered by the calorie. But the most shocking realization for the German Poes was the concept of the refill. In the German military, you took your portion and you were grateful. If you asked for more, you were disciplined. In the American mess halls, the prisoners watched in disbelief as American soldiers went back for second, third, and even fourth helpings of mashed potatoes and gravy. There was no guard standing over the food bin with a bayonet. There was just more food. This culture of plenty shattered the German belief in their own superiority. They realized that the decadent democracy they had been taught to despise was actually a giant that couldn't be exhausted. Even the way the food was served was a form of psychological warfare. The Americans used heavy porcelain plates and stainless steel utensils, while the Germans were used to dented tin cans and wooden spoons. To be treated with such material dignity while being a prisoner of war was a confusion that many Germans couldn't process. They were waiting for the cruelty, but it never came. Instead, they got more coffee. Real, aromatic, caffeinated coffee. In Germany, they were drinking ersatz coffee made from burnt acorns and chicory. The smell of real American coffee beans roasting in the camp kitchens was enough to make grown men weep. It was the smell of a world they had lost, and a world they now realized they wanted to be a part of. The logistics of this abundance were mind-boggling. The U.S. military was shipping millions of tons of food across the ocean, yet they still had enough to provide 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day to their prisoners. When the German officers saw the nutritional charts posted on the walls of the camps, they realized that the American prisoner was eating better than the German general staff. This wasn't just about kindness. It was a display of industrial arrogance. America was saying, "We can feed you better than your own fur can, and we won't even feel the cost." By the time the war reached its final months, the stories of the American paradise had filtered back to the front lines through letters and secret messages. German soldiers began to surrender in droves, not out of cowardice, but out of a desperate desire to reach the kitchens of the West. They knew that surrender didn't mean death. It meant a hot shower and a plate of beef. The American kitchen had become the most effective recruiting tool for surrender in military history. In the end, the giant food servings of America were the ultimate proof that the 20th century belonged to the nation that could master production. The German Poes were stunned not just by the size of the meals, but by the freedom that those meals represented. They learned that a nation that can afford to be generous to its enemies is a nation that can never truly be defeated. As they looked at their empty trays at the end of a long day of work, they didn't see the face of a conqueror. They saw the face of a neighbor who had too much of everything and didn't mind sharing. This was the culinary defeat of the Third Reich, of victory won by the baker, the farmer, and the cook long before the politicians signed the peace treaties. The war was over. The guns had fallen silent across Europe, but for the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war held in America, the real shock was only beginning. For years, they had lived in a world of impossible abundance, a land where meat, white bread, and sugar were treated like common air. But as the time for repatriation approached, these men faced a terrifying realization. They were leaving the American paradise to return to a Germany that had been reduced to a scorched, skeletal wasteland. The final chapter of the German POW experience is perhaps the most emotional and shocking of all, as it highlights the brutal contrast between the world that fed them and the world they had destroyed. As the prisoners were prepared for their journey home, the American military did something that seemed almost cruel in its generosity. They gave the departing prisoners a final send-off. Many POWs were given new clothes, sturdy boots, and most importantly rations for the journey. But as they looked at their own reflections in the mirrors of the barracks, they saw men who didn't look like soldiers of a defeated army. They were tan, they were strong, and many had gained significant weight. They were the healthiest Germans on the planet, fed by the very enemy they had been told to hate. They were walking symbols of a logistical miracle, but their hearts were heavy with a new kind of fear. How can we tell our starving families about the life we lived while they were eating boiled grass? The journey back across the Atlantic was a somber one. When the ships finally docked in European ports, the German men stepped off the boats and were met with a sight that shattered their souls. They saw women and children with hollow eyes, digging through frozen dirt for scraps of rotten potatoes. They saw cities like Berlin and Dresden, which were now nothing more than jagged piles of red brick and ash. The men who had been eating steak and drinking fresh milk just weeks ago in Kansas were now standing in a graveyard. The guilt was overwhelming. One soldier wrote in his diary, "I felt ashamed of my own health. I felt ashamed of every slice of white bread I had complained about in America, while my mother was chewing on leather to survive." The homecoming created a strange and bitter tension in German households. When these men sat down at their family tables, there was nothing to eat but hunger soup, a thin broth made from cabbage leaves and water. When they tried to describe the American camps, their families often reacted with anger or disbelief. "You are lying," one woman reportedly screamed at her husband. "No one gives beef to a prisoner. You must have worked for the Americans as a spy." The stories of unlimited butter, ice cream barges, and mountains of chocolate were so far removed from the reality of post-war Germany that the POWs were often accused of being brainwashed. The truth was too painful to accept. Their enemies had treated them better than their own leaders ever had. But the most powerful legacy of the giant food servings was not the bitterness, but the transformation of a nation. These well-fed prisoners became the backbone of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of West Germany. They had seen what a free, industrial democracy could achieve. They had tasted the fruit of a nation that valued production over destruction. They returned home not just with full stomachs, but with a blueprint for a new kind of Germany. They had learned that the secret to power wasn't in the size of your tanks, but in the efficiency of your farms and the depth of your supply lines. The memory of that American white bread became a symbol of the life they wanted to build for their children. There is a legendary story of an American officer who visited a small German town in 1947. He met a former POW who had been held in a camp in Utah. The German man took the officer's hand and thanked him not for freedom or safety, but for an orange he had been given in 1945. He said, "That orange was the first thing that made me realize Hitler was a liar." He told us Americans were savages, but savages don't give oranges to their enemies. It was the victory of the American kitchen, stripping away propaganda 1 calorie at a time and replacing it with a human connection no bullets could destroy. As the years passed, the legend of the American meal grew. It became part of German folklore, the story of a land where bread was white as snow and meat never ran out. For Americans, it was logistics. They had food, so they fed the men. For the Germans, it was awakening. It showed them that a nation's strength lies in generosity. Those who returned home understood democracy was not just politics, it was a way of life ensuring no one had to fight simply to eat. The giant food servings that stunned captured soldiers became normal in the Western world. Abundance that seemed miraculous in 1944 became everyday life. For men who survived frozen trenches, that abundance was unforgettable. It did not just win a war. It helped win the peace, turning enemies into allies through the simple act of sharing a meal.